Production and distribution of City Club forums on IdeaStream Public Media are made possible by PNC and the United Black Fund of Greater Cleveland, Incorporated.
Y'all here? Okay. Good afternoon, and welcome to the City Club of Cleveland, where we are devoted to conversations of consequence to help democracy thrive. It's Friday, July 7th, and I'm Evelyn Burnett, co-founder and CEO of Third Space Action Lab and Reading Room, and moderator for today's conversation. Today I'm joined by my dear friend and mentor, Pastor Michael McBride, or Pastor Mike, as many of us lovingly call him. He is a native of San Francisco and the director of the Live Free USA campaign, which is a nonprofit organization and social justice network doing groundbreaking work dedicated to ending gun violence, mass incarceration, and mass criminalization through education, advocacy, and direct action. According to Cleveland's Department of Public Health, homicides per 100,000 residents increased by 42% in 2020 and remain high in 2021. Firearms comprise 86% of those homicides in the city. In our neighborhoods across the country and here in Cleveland, there have been renewed calls for gun violence to be declared a public health crisis, as well as adequate funding and follow-through on promises to address the crisis. In fact, several mothers impacted by gun violence recently submitted public comment to the Cleveland City Council asking for these things. As Americans, we celebrated our freedom and independence earlier this week. It is fitting that today we dive into conversation with Pastor Mike and talk about how Live Free USA is building a new system of community-driven public safety that truly brings peace, freedom, justice, and healing to our neighborhoods and communities. If you have a question for Pastor Mike, you can text it to 330-541-5794. That's 330-541-5794. You can also tweet your question at the City Club, and the City Club staff will try to work it into the second half of the program. Members and friends of the City Club of Cleveland, please join me in welcoming Pastor Mike. All right. Pastor, you know this is an honor and privilege for me to be with you today.
Please understand the privilege is all mine.
Y'all know how this is about to go, right? Okay. So at Third Space Action Lab, we always start every conversation with a soul check. We think it's really important to just check in on the soul for all human beings, but certainly for those of us doing this work. So is it okay if we start with a soul check? Sure. It's a three-parter. Okay, so the first part is if you were describing your soul today as a song or an artist or a piece of art, what would it be and why is the first question. And then the second is who do you dedicate this conversation to and why? And what's the best advice you've received that sustains you in this work?
There's a song that the Winans used to sing called "It's Been a Long Time Coming, but a change is gonna come. I've waited till the morning, the evening," and I think they use the other days too, "wondering when will I see the sun." So yeah, I feel like my soul is just described by that. It's been a long time coming, and I think my soul is longing for a change to come. I always think of the young men that I've lost to gun violence, and so Larry is a name that always comes to the front of my mind. He was a young man that we worked with in the Bay, who I started out the work doing counseling inside continuation schools, and Larry was one of our most, charismatic but caught up in the streets young man, and I just thought if I could just get him to graduate from high school, then, he'll have enough momentum and a year after we got him through high school, he was killed in Oakland in a liquor store. And so I do this in Larry's name. And in some of the names of the young men that we did get through school and they're still alive. And so Charles and a few brothers like that. The third question, post-COVID memory is quite challenging.
What's the best advice you've received that sustained you in the work?
Do it for the people. And if you don't love the people, you can't lead the people.
That's right.
So it's very hard to help people that you're afraid of. So you got to do it for the people.
Sounds like some other folks got that advice as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that soul check.
Hey, we try to do a soul check. We gotta make sure that we're okay. Okay. I want to try to set the context there. I know that our audience and certainly the Third Space folks are going to have great questions about solutions, and we'll get to that. But I really want to kind of try to set the context for what we're talking about. But I think to do that, who is Michael McBride? Who is Pastor Michael McBride? And why do you do what you do?
Well, I'm a fourth generation holiness Pentecostal from the city of San Francisco. Touch your name. We got some tongue talkers in the room. These I do speak in tongues. I do roll on the floor, swing from the chandeliers. On a good Sunday, I'll levitate. Somebody say amen.
Amen.
Right? Amen. And but it also means that I am a black man in a very white supremacist, racist society. And so being a tongue-talking Pentecostal Christian does not exempt me from the very violent, racist systems and structures that prey on my soul, body, mind, and spirit. And so I'm also a survivor. I've been physically and sexually assaulted by police officers when I was a youth pastor in San Jose in 1999. I've lost too many of my friends and young folks to gun violence. And I'm a father. Just went through a divorce, so I'm now working to be a co-parent with my mother's children, to be a good father and a good co-parent. And I love black people. I love everybody else too. But I'm in love with black people. Something about them.
Me too.
My God, today. Okay, I'll be serious. I'm at the City Club.
No, this is great. This Dan wants this, right, Dan? Yeah. Okay. They said we can say what we want to say. So okay. So one of my when I said in the intro that Pastor Mike is a dear mentor and friend, and my big sister Cherie is here, and we were when I was still living in New York, she had me in all kind of stuff, and so I remembered last night that when I thought I first met you, had met you prior. But when you really had such a profound impact on my life was when Cherie and I came down to Ferguson following Mike Brown's murder. And my mom, who's here, was like, no.
Where your mama at?
She's right there. And my pa right there.
Mother, bless you.
And they were like, no, you can't go down. Because remember, what we were watching from our TVs at home just looked like a war zone. It's tanks in the streets.
And it was.
And it was. And I arrived, and it was. But as I watched you when we were on the ground there, and it was still just so hot, I was really in awe of the way that you engaged with folks that were so deeply hurt, enraged, dejected. So I'm curious if you could tell us about, and so I see a difference in the way that you respond to this just kind of compounding hurt and pain that we feel and experience as Americans, but certainly as Black Americans. So what's different about the way that you kind of show up and respond in the midst of such compounding trauma and pain and hurt, and keep yourself and others hopeful?
The scriptures have taught me that we don't wrestle against flesh and blood, but against principalities, spiritual wickedness in high places. And so I am continuously trying to remind myself that the greatest enemy or threat to the world God has imagined is not always the people I see. And even the greatest expression of the rage, hurt, pain, violence, trauma, and even death is not always a result of the people I see. I'm just most proximate to those folks. And so a place like Ferguson or a place like the streets of, East Oakland, West Oakland. I was in Detroit yesterday or the day before. I've been in a lot of different cities across the country. Because much of my work in ministry is very proximal to suffering Black people. I can't be angry at Black people for their rage. Because we have been turned inside out by this country. And no one is stopping it. People who claim to be our allies don't care to stop it. People who claim to be from our communities won't stop it. And so when things hit a tipping point in an individual or in a community, and they're filled with rage as a faith leader, a pastor, someone who's committed to healing work, if I can be a source of equilibrium or trying to reset the conditions for healing of the hurt of our people, that is my responsibility to be that in as much as I can. And so, my approach to this work is out of a deep sense of love and possibility. And, it's easier to just to reduce people to their worst manifested impulses. And so I always try to show up not reaching for such an easy response, And so, I try to move throughout the world, particularly in this work, appreciating the historical continuum of pain and suffering we have been subjected to as a people, and appreciate that if we as a people don't save ourselves, no one has shown themselves committed enough to save us. Now, I'm always open for folk to prove me wrong. Touch your neighbor. So if y'all want to prove me wrong, then, please. But until then, we don't have a lot of time to just turn on one another. I feel like it's always my responsibility to show up and try to bridge and not break, to try to heal and not harm, to try to listen and not speak, to try to be present and not dominate. And my experience is as I do that, all the things that I feel blessed to contribute find a way to manifest without me having to, throw my weight around.
I want to ask
I didn't have as much weight during the Ferguson years.
Well, I wanted to go just dig a little deeper before we kind of pivot because
that was Michael 2.0. This is
you seem like you had a lot of weight to me, but okay. So can you say I've heard you talk often about the legitimacy of Black outrage. And so I'm curious, because you started to talk about the historical context, and I don't want nobody to leave the room without making sure that we understand kind of this legitimacy and how it's different and why it's different, perhaps, from...
There's not been one day in the history of this country that dark-skinned bodies, and I'll throw in indigenous bodies as well, have not been subjected to arbitrary violence at the hands of the state. Not one day.
Yeah.
There has also not been one day in this country where white folks, however you define yourselves, because not all white folks were considered white at one time in this country, but that's a conversation for another day, who have had the power to stop said violence have been successful in doing so. And so I am not someone who makes excuses for people's foibles and idiosyncrasies, et cetera, but I have found that to try and steal the rage from people who have been perpetually harmed is to steal their humanity. Now, rage is not enough, though, because you can be consumed by rage, and then that rage can spill out on the people that you love. But there is a inhumanity at work in this country to ask black people to be silent about our pain, to fix our pain with no resources, to believe the good in everyone else except for our own folks, and to defer to people who despise us to be the architects of our future. Man, I think that's a ridiculous assertion. I cannot go into anyone else's community and try to fix their community. But folk love to come into our community and want to work with Pookie and them. Don't even want to talk to Pookie's mom and daddy and them because, they too hard to deal with. It's like, so, yeah, I think black people got a lot to be angry about. But, I don't believe that rage is enough, So it has to be mixed with, a certain sense of love and purpose, and has to turn into fuel. The scriptures talk about righteous indignation, so I think rage can have a righteous kind of purpose or role. But yeah, I think this country is too quick to ask black folk not to be upset. And so...
be patient.
Yeah, James Baldwin said it, right? How long must I wait for your progress? Can't nobody say it like Jimmy Baldwin. Y'all go listen to him. But, I think it's really important for us to not ask folks to just continue to be patient while we watch many other kinds of human beings benefit from our labor, our genius, our contributions, the homes we built, the churches we built, everything. And then, we just continue to, at every era in this country be described as criminals, violent, inhumane, unintelligent people. At every era in this country's history, I just feel like, man, that's a trip. How are we unintelligent and we building monuments that's still standing? They didn't come from aliens unless, y'all believe that stuff from them history channels, I guess.
So I want to pivot a little bit but kind of continue in the context. What is the state of gun violence in America? And importantly, what are folks getting wrong about their perceptions of the state?
Yeah, so I'll start with what I think people are getting wrong. Gun violence in this country has become particularly nuanced in how it expresses itself, right? So when we talk about gun violence, we often, kind of flatten the conversation. The national gun violence headlines are driven now by mass shootings. The biggest perpetrators of gun violence in the national imagination are young black men. Neither of which give enough of a nuanced description of how violence vis-a-vis guns show up in our communities. There are at least 4 or 5 ways gun violence shows up. Obviously, I've mentioned, mass shootings. I've mentioned the kind of intra-communal violence or conflicts that happen in very disinvested, often black, brown, and particular Asian communities across the country. But, we have to talk about intimate partner violence or domestic violence. We have to talk about accidental shootings. We have to talk about suicides. And all of these forms of gun violence require a particular response. The same way you have a neurosurgeon who works on your brain, dentists who work on your teeth, heart surgeons who work on your heart. You can get a doctor and ask a doctor to do a particular form of surgery, and they probably will not do as well of a job as the specialists. And so we do not, I believe, talk about gun violence with enough nuance, and so it creates lots of scarcity, mindsets. It certainly creates lots of well-meaning but ineffective responses. And it leads me to the first part of the question, what is the state of gun violence? I think we are probably much further along than we have ever been in my, let's say, career, a lifetime doing this work. And to God be the glory for that work and for so many, some of you in this room and so many of our comrades across the country who have been pushing to make sure that gun violence is seen as a public health issue, not a punitively criminal issue, to make sure that victims and survivors are being extended much more mental health, behavioral health, and trauma support, particularly those who are caught in communities like this, and that massive amounts of resources, federal tax dollars, state tax dollars, municipal tax dollars should be brought to bear to build a sector of peacemaking and healing in every city and community across this country that matches the scale of law enforcement and carceral services in our communities. That, to me, is the state of where we, I hope, are moving towards. And I think we're the leaning tower of, is it Pisa? We're finally leaning in that direction. And it's great to see, because a decade ago, I almost got put out the White House during the Obama administration, just trying to win some of them over in that way. So might help things change in 10 years.
What were the barriers? And what do you think has instigated that change in a post-Obama America? Okay. Should we go there? I mean, we should.
Yeah, you can go anywhere. You know what I mean? Just trying to not make a mess here. I do believe that most people do not believe that we could end gun violence. And so whether they are an elected official, faith leader, whether they are a business person, whether they're Republican, Democrat, I think there's a certain kind of inevitability. And so if that is your posture towards a problem as magnanimous as this, then you have already been shackled by hopelessness. And hopelessness is as deadly as a bullet. I do think that people at the highest level of the federal government, particularly during the Obama administration and perhaps before, they told me this, and I heard this from many places, guns were the third rail of politics. We don't talk about guns because that is a surefire way to lose consensus, perhaps even lose an election. Certainly, you're not going to get a lot of traction. And I think for the president, Newtown changed that for him, and as he felt he had to respond. But I think for many of us in our communities, we just had to do better organizing, quite frankly. We had to create and construct better communications campaigns. We had to scale up some of these strategies that have worked, and I think all of that has created a tipping point that has gotten us to this point. But we are still a bit of ways, I think, from breaking the conventional thinking that gun violence is inevitable, particularly in Black communities.
Thank you. I'm curious about one of the things that we were talking a little bit about last night was kind of our governance and our government structures and the things that compound what we very much feel in communities. You said something I thought was interesting that I would love for you to share more about. What is it about the way that governance and governments are structured that every Black community is continuing to experience these compounding impacts of things like displacement is what we were talking about. Can you say more about that?
Yeah, I think that there continues to be an inability. What's so fascinating, obviously, being from the Bay Area, I've often said to progressive lawmakers that the worst conditions of the Bay Area are not because of Donald Trump or the Republicans, because everybody has a boogeyman. And for a lot of progressives, the boogeyman is the Republicans or Donald Trump. But progressives don't find ways to govern in ways that solve some of these big problems either. So perhaps the problem is not necessarily easily reduced to Republicans and Democrats, although there are levels to this. I think Trump showed us that. And if you are a Donald Trump supporter, then, I pray for you on Sunday and levitate real good. God will break through. Not like Paula White, not that kind of breakthrough, but different kind, right? But I do think governance, elected officials, if I could say so, suffer from a limited imagination. And it is always, my elected official friends say, Pastor Mike, it's easy for you to always be critical of the work we do because you're not in this job. I said, no, that's very true. I said, but you asked to be in that job. So, you can't have it both ways. You can't be like, you're immune from the people's critique of your ineffective governance. If you have been in charge for decades and you have not solved problems, either you ought to quit that job and go get another job, or you ought to humble yourself at the feet of the people who are most proximal to those problems and allow your imagination to be informed by the brilliance of people who are enduring said problems. And so I often have great concern for a lot of folks who aspire for elected positions and they go through these, cookie cutter, candidate ready programs that teach you how to be a bad politician, right? But teach you how to win elections. And then as soon as you win an election, you are told by that same consultant that you have 2 years before you have to start thinking about your next election, particularly if you want to get to another seat. That, to me, is theft. It is you're a theft of time. You are a theft of the people's resources, and you are, the people deserve better. And so I do think that governance is the next frontier for justice work in this country, because I think in the movement space, we have, I think, recovered the need to win campaigns, elections, but we've not figured out how to impact effective governance, particularly on behalf of those who need effective governance to live, not to thrive. There's some folks who I think have figured out how to thrive off of ineffective governance. But we need governance that can help the people who are suffering to live. And I think we, particularly who are people of color, particularly black folks who are running for offices, we better run with some courage and some imagination. St. Augustine said that every Christian should run for office and govern in a way that they could never win re-election. And I said, that's the kind of politician I want.
I want to try to get one more question in before we turn it over to the audience.
Sorry, I'm alone with
That's okay. No, this is perfect. And I'm going to try to, Mordecai's in the doc and all kind of stuff, so I'm going to try to pull some questions together. Want to give you an opportunity before I'm sure folks ask additional questions about what is Live Free, but I want to say a little bit more, for us to end a little bit more on imagination. And one of the texts that really deeply impacts Third Space's work is Freedom Dreams, a Black Radical Imagination by Robin D.G. Kelly. Y'all should all buy it. You can get it at the reading room. And so as you're describing Live Free and what it does, I'd love for you also to reflect on, like, how would we know when we are achieving freedom, justice, and healing? Like, how would we know? And we think a lot, like, as we're trying to think about solutions, like, what would it feel like? What would it smell like? What would it taste like? Just try to engage the senses that we experience every day. And then is it possible Can you talk about some of the ways that you humanize the issue of gun violence in Black communities? For example, the way Ryan Coogler illustrated the cost of police violence against a Black man community in Oakland via Fruitville.
Ralph Ellison has this quote that I read, I think I was in high school. It was one of the first books my English teacher had me read. It was a brother by the name of Mr. Brown, coolest cat. Only brother I knew with a ponytail growing up that, was not intimidated by anybody. His Brown knocked him upside the head. But he had me read Ralph Ellison, The Invisible Man. He says, "I am invisible, understand, simply because people refuse to see me. Like the bodiless heads you sometimes see in circus sideshows, it is as though I have been surrounded by mirrors of hard, distorting glass, and when they approach me, they see only my surroundings, themselves, or figments of their imagination. Indeed, they see everything and anything except for me." That is what Live Free has been trying to change for well over a decade. I remember talking to a host of young men, and I don't have time because I be talking long. I know I'm not succinct. But I remember one good brother told my brother Ben, we were talking about, him moving past the violent conflicts he was in. And he said, if I put this gun down, it'll make you feel safe. But it ain't gonna make me feel safe. And so when are we gonna move past the conversation about you feeling safe and talk about how I can be safe?
Yes.
Right? And it became very clear to me that even we who are do-gooders are often spending more time obsessing about our own safety rather than the actual folks who are at the highest risk of shooting, being shot, or being incarcerated. And so our work has to be centered and built around directly impacted people, their genius, their leadership, their pain, their stories. We must invest in them, but not put them in places or situations where their inexperience can be exploited by those who thrive off of terrible governance. I do believe that organizing is critical to any city or community that's trying to build an ecosystem of public safety or community safety, and that we must believe that organizing people leads to the best possible outcomes in your city, and not trying to attach people to the failed systems of our cities as an extension of those failed systems so we can maintain control over these folks, right? So there's a whole lot of things. Now, I also, want to say to our loved ones and comrades, this work is sacred work. Like, very few people get to wake up every day and be compensated for saving people's lives. And so there is a certain kind of integrity that we must bring to this work that does not turn us into the exploiters of our own pain, right? If you don't read books, you have very little to say. And I know some of us may not have a super high reading comprehension because you went to a terrible school, but guess what? They have audiobooks. We must be learners and curious. I can't tell you how many cities I've gone to across the country and people are like, "Oh, Pastor Mike, but your city, this ain't no city like Cleveland." You're right, we do win championships in the Bay. So I get it. Y'all know I had to say something. Y'all messed up our greatest basketball season in history.
He's still mad.
So you're right. Not every city's like Cleveland, right? But I will say Um, most cities are. Yeah, that's what I'm talking about. Where y'all messed up our we still mad about that in the Bay. We very upset about it. But I have found that many cities that we've traveled to, they are more alike than they are not. The conditions of our people are often the same. The egos of certain folk with certain titles and positions are the same. The patterns and rhythms of disinvestment is very similar. And the antagonists to peace, freedom, and justice in many of our cities often are the same as well. And so we ought not to think we are all so unique that we can't learn from each other's wisdom. And some cities have built better collaborative, multiracial, multi-class campaigns to end gun violence and injustice than others. Some communities, by nature of the challenge that cities have had to build it a different kind of way. But there are through lines, right? And it is about curiosity, integrity, taking your craft seriously, being open to being trained, and having an intergenerational kind of wisdom exchange. Like, all of these things to me are super important. And I'll stop because, again, I'm a black preacher that can, I can talk. Somebody say amen.
Amen. Okay, we're about to begin the audience Q&A. I'm Evelyn Burnett, co-founder and CEO of Third Space Action Lab and Reading Room, and moderator for today's conversation. We welcome questions from everyone: City Club members, guests, students, and those joining via our live stream at cityclub.org or radio broadcast at 89.7 WKSU Idea Stream Public Media. If you'd like to tweet a question for Pastor Mike, please tweet at the City Club. You can also text it to 330-541-5794. That's 330-541-5794. And the City Club staff will try to work it into the program. May we please have the first question?
Hello. Pastor Mike, we found our first text question. It says, what can young people do to avoid violence who are already living in the midst of violent communities, and how can adults help them?
Her question was, what is it that young people can do to avoid violence if they're already living in particularly violent communities, and what can adults do to help? So, I often tell young people that one of your most important commitments is to commit to nonviolence. Learn how to be a person of nonviolence. Learn how to engage in conflict resolution. Learn how to walk away. Learn how to run. Learn how to not allow the pressure of your community to make you feel like violence is your most chief option. And then I tell adults to do the same thing. Because we must appreciate that our young people are often learning behaviors from the worlds we have created. And we often are asking young people to respond to situations in ways adults don't even respond. Adults who are trained don't even respond. Adults who get paid to respond differently don't even respond. Adults who know better. Right? So I do believe that being a person of nonviolence is critical for everyone to adopt, and also to appreciate, and we'll perhaps get into this a little bit later, that the number of people who are driving gun-related shootings and homicides in our cities is a relatively small number of people in our cities. And so we must resist the urge to unleash collective punishment and or stereotypes on large swaths of people when it is actually less than 1%, some would argue from the data, less than half of 1% of your city's population that is literally responsible for as much as 60% of the gun-related shootings and homicides in your city. If you and I are building a public safety solution thinking it's tens of thousands of people rather than hundreds of people, then you will have lots of collateral and collective harm that will actually turn peaceful people into violent people. So it's very important, I think, to first commit to being a nonviolent person, and then those who are susceptible to violence because of their trauma, their anger, their fear, their pain, we must have targeted interventions for those folks, and then usher them hopefully into a space of nonviolence while we try to change the world, dare I say the government, of whom Dr. Martin Luther King says the United States government is the greatest purveyor of violence in the world. Sit with that before you start asking young people about why they so violent.
So, is it on? Can you hear me? Mic check. Okay. So I want to kind of sit with that for a minute because you talk a lot about organizing, and it sounds like when we talk about organizing, we think about, the lake is on fire, and we're trying to save the fish down the stream, but we're not figuring out what is poisoning the lake in the first place. And we know our government and NRA and politicians who are bought off by NRA are poisoning the fish down the stream. And so I really want to kind of wrestle with how we do that as organizers on the ground. We can organize people, but if we continue to get the proliferation of poison into the stream, it does leave us feeling hopeless because we can't shut off the valve that's pouring poison in the river.
Yeah, so, when I say organizing, I mean it by organize people, organize ideas, organize money. And I think that organizing has to be at its core about relational power building of people, institutions, neighborhoods that have a shared purpose and vision over time. The way you organize to win, if I were to use this analogy, we use in our organizing work all the time. If you have a problem and the problem is a loaf of bread, none of us eat a loaf of bread all at one time. Or maybe some of you do. You have a real dry mouth at the end of that process, right? How do you eat a loaf of bread? One slice at a time. The power of organizing is a commitment over time to build people power to solve sustained problems. Any organizing that is powerful will eventually produce indigenous leaders who, with the people kind of behind them, emerge to positions of decision making. Hopefully that is tied to accountability of those said people. And so the way we get upstream is to create better leaders that come out of our organizing. That is a long-term solution, but we do not have to wait to end gun violence in our communities we don't have to wait to end gun violence in our communities while we build that long-term momentum. It has been our experience. We've been able to reduce gun violence by 20, 30, 40% within 18 months of some of these strategies properly and well resourced and coordinated, implemented. And I think organizing and implementation of some of these strategies need not be mutually exclusive. They ought to be deeply integrated and done with lots of efficacy and care.
Thank you. Please.
So, I live in a city where there is a lot of gun violence. But I also live in a city where the people who are supposed to protect us are scared to protect us. And we have these little young people that are growing up who are very, very, very disrespectful. How do we stop our anger because they're not listening to us? And then you have the people who are supposed to protect us scared to protect us, and they just stand there, and these kids run circles around the adults that are there to protect us. They don't understand that they're there to protect them too, but you come on our street and you act a fool, and you don't want to respect our street as adults, homeowners. And we're trying to tell you this is not right. What do we do as adults and homeowners for our little, I can't even call them little children. When I see them and they come in packs, I call them roaches because they look like roaches just coming on the street. And they are so disrespectful to the police officers. I don't know what to do.
Right.
So what do we do?
No, it's an important question, and I think a lot of us need to appreciate. We need to appreciate that there are a lot of, I would say, elders in my community. I'll talk about my community, and like I say, I think lots of cities are the same, who are exasperated by the problem of violence, who are afraid for their lives, who feel like their lifetime of struggle to get a little bit of this American dream is being ripped away from them from their grandchildren. So we have to sit with that, right? And we who are offended by the descriptions of our most, highest at-risk children and young people need to, as I did, take it upon myself or ourselves to be the solution to her problem. Right? Because it is true that there is a group of young folks who have been abandoned. And they are being raised in a predatory environment. Right? And if you are being raised in a predatory environment, you cannot be angry at someone who then responds with predatory behavior. Especially if they are not the ones that have created that environment. So I do believe that there has to be some collective responsibility of all of us as stakeholders to make sure that the young men and others who are unaccountable, often abandoned. If you talk with many of the young men, and some of us have to really slow our lives down enough to talk with these young folk and appreciate. I learned during COVID. I mean, we have very robust work in our communities. COVID hit, and it was like an atomic bomb to all of the work we had built. We had a 50% reduction in gun-related shootings and homicides in 5 years. Heading into COVID, we were on track to have it maybe get as low as 55 homicides. 5 years previous, we were at 135 homicides. So we were tracking in the right direction, but COVID literally, it wiped out a whole network of big mamas, aunties, elders who were taking care of children. These children then became homeless overnight. I was in a room with some preachers trying to explain to them, because, they all turned up, we need the National Guard. Negro preachers love to call for the National Guard. I'd be like, where's that in the Bible, right? It's like, why everybody call for the National Guard? You really want the army in your neighborhood? Really? That's historically worked out for us as a people, I'm sure, right? But in this meeting with the preachers, there's this one young man who was kind of becoming known of robbing folk, et cetera, and in the course of our interaction with him, we found out he was living in a Jeep with his younger brother. This young man is 15 years old, living in a Jeep with his younger brother outside one of the prominent black churches in Oakland. And none of us knew about it. And when we found out about it, there were people still more upset with him robbing folk than the fact that he's living outside of our church in a Jeep with his brother. Why are we not upset about that? And so we have to ask ourselves a lot of questions. Who taught us to fall out of love with our own children? Who told us that? Like, where did that come from? Who taught us that police departments, police officers are actually the people who are the solution to this problem? Who told us that? Who taught us that? Why is it that we have not interrogated some of our own assumptions about the solutions and the problems when we have such a rich history and a challenging history living within our bones and in our institutions, right? And so I just think we have to sit with mothers. I hear that as a cry for help, right? And so who in this room is going to follow up with mother to help solve that problem? I mean, I would love to. I don't live here in Cleveland. Yeah, it's a long commute for me to go, but if I lived here, I would get her number. And I would find out what street she lived on, and I would show up with 20 of my bros, and we would meet every little shorty on that block and find out why you terrorizing mother's house. I mean, it's that simple. I don't need the police to solve that problem. That's a relationship. But a lot of us brothers, keep it real, we afraid. We afraid of these young fellas. I said a lot. I didn't say all. I didn't say all. I said a lot. And so all I'm saying is we must be the solution to this problem. And I will say the way that the city can help, the way that the business community can help, the way elected officials can help is to make sure that when we step up to be the solution, we are not doing it as volunteers. We're not doing it as charity work. It is a profession that has benefits, a retirement plan, a professional development plan. It has an institutional infrastructure so it can be scaled and sustained without having to go beg people to keep the doors open. Can you imagine? I gotta stop.
No, it's okay. You got 2 minutes. You got 2 minutes.
I
You got
feel
2
my
minutes. You
help
got 2 minutes.
Can you imagine how ridiculous it would be if police departments had to ask foundations for grants to keep their budgets fully funded? I mean, some of you are like, what? No. Fire departments had a shortfall. They had to go to the Cleveland Foundation. Go to Kellogg and Ford. Hey, I got a $2 million deficit. Can you give me a grant to make sure I can send a fire truck up into the hills to keep that mansion from burning down? That sounds ridiculous, right? But we have a fire in the neighborhood, and we asking folk to be firefighters for free. It is a failure of leadership and governance. And so when mother stands up and asks for help, some of us who are the solution need to stand up. And when the solution stand up, the money people need to stand up too and be like, I will do my part. When we were shutting down freeways, trying to get justice for all the loved ones who've been killed, I told some elected official, what is the most radical thing you can do? Because maybe you can't shut down the freeway. Although you could. There's a seat for you right here. We can lay down here right together. Go to jail together. Somebody say amen. We do it all together, man. I don't know, Pastor Mike, it's not my call. Okay, well, what is your calling? What's the most radical thing you can do within the bounds of the law to save people's lives? Do that. But don't talk to me about what is not possible. Everything is possible.
Everything is possible. I love you. We're going to continue these conversations where's Dan? At the Inner City Club of Cleveland. Mordecai termed that back at the Third Space Action Lab and certainly after. But thank you, Pastor Mike, for joining us at the City Club today. We gotta wrap for the radio. We're going to talk after. No, we got it. I got to keep going. We're gonna talk after. The City Club would like to welcome guests at the tables hosted by ANIBA, a Neighborhood Environment Betterment Alliance, Cleveland Peacemakers Alliance, the Cleveland Teachers Union, MyCom, Third Space Action Lab, and Youth Opportunities Unlimited. Thank you all for being here today. Next Friday, July 14th, the City Club will be joined by Ron Richard, President and CEO of the Cleveland Foundation. He will
Come back and ask your question to him.
He will be in conversation with Tony Richardson of the Gun Foundation, talking about his insights and lessons from his tenure at the Cleveland Foundation. You can learn more about this forum and others at cityclub.org. And that brings us to the end of today's forum. Thank you again, Pastor Mike. And thank you, members, friends, and the City Club. I'm Evelyn Burnett, and this forum is now adjourned.
For information on upcoming speakers or for podcasts of the City Club, go to cityclub.org.
Production and distribution of City Club forums on IdeaStream Public Media are made possible by PNC and the United Black Fund of Greater Cleveland, Incorporated.